Well, Melissa, thank you so much for joining me. Let's start things off with a quick introduction about yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure being here. Yeah, so I live in Chicago, as you know, and I have been in HR and recruiting for over 2 decades. I spent 18 years at a company called Baxter Healthcare. I'm sure you've heard of Baxter. It ultimately turned into Takeda Pharmaceuticals. They moved my position to Boston and they offered me a relo, and my kids were in high school at the time, and I said I cannot move. So I ended up leaving the company. Again, it was a great 18-year run. I don't regret 1 second of my time there. And then fast forward to today, I have a couple businesses. I do individual one-on-one coaching for job seekers, helping them with their resumes, LinkedIn profiles, and job search strategies. I also work with different companies on content creation. I have a pretty large LinkedIn following, so I work with select companies on, I guess you can say, brand partnerships. I'm a certified yoga instructor, so I teach a couple classes a week. And then I also have a 4-week job search program with a partner of mine. And then in addition, I do talent acquisition consulting for biotechnology startups in the San Francisco area. So I have many different things going on. I have many balls in the air, but it's been good.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's safe to say that you have a lot of things happening right now,
Yes.
and we'll have to put a pin in the yoga conversation. I didn't know that about you, so we'll have to
Yeah.
talk about that later because I've gotten quite into some hot yoga, so I'll have to learn more about
Oh,
what you're doing
good. Yeah.
there. Yeah, I remember. I remember. Obviously, as you know, in the Chicago area too. I remember the big Baxter building and then the Takeda
Mhm.
building, and so it sounds like that's where a lot of your journey was. So you were working. I mean, those are some really big companies,
Yeah.
and those roles were all in person. Talk to me a little bit about your journey. Have you been all in person HR and talent acquisition roles? Anything remote? What have the environments been like?
Yeah, so for the first 10 years, I was an HR business partner, and back then, working remote really wasn't a thing. And so I worked in the office. And what was nice is that I lived 10 minutes away from the office. So it really wasn't a big deal to come in. But that role was, I literally traveled across the country for 10 years, usually on a moment's notice. And I did a lot of terminations, I did a lot of workplace investigations. But what was happening was a lot of the travel was taking me away from my family. And because a lot of it was like, okay, Melissa, we need you on a plane tomorrow, it was getting really, really difficult on my husband. So I approached my boss and I said, I need to do something different. This just is not working anymore for my family life. And I was very lucky in that the company created a position for me to start the talent acquisition function for that business from inception. And my boss basically said, you have an open checkbook. You have whatever budget you need, hire as many people as you need to, pick out the technology, create the processes, figure this out, and you're going to have my full blessing. Long story short, I ended up with a team of 12 direct reports. We managed the hiring for about 3,000 employees a year. So it was a lot of high volume hiring. We were the largest business globally. And my team, my talent acquisition team, we were the largest business globally in terms of talent acquisition across the world for Takeda. And at that point, it was Takeda Pharmaceuticals. And I basically built this multiple award winning team from the ground up. And I was very blessed because I had the full appreciation and full confidence of my boss, who was always very good to me. And so, looking back, it wasn't always easy and there were a lot of pain points, but, I grew a team of 12 people. I hired them all, I trained them all. And we were multiple award winning global awards. And then by the time I left the company, I was a global director of talent acquisition. At one time, I had 24 direct reports because I assumed another job when my colleague resigned. So I had like 2 full-time jobs for a while as well, which got to be, just complete madness. But yeah, I mean, I was very sad when the company moved to Boston. I was very appreciative of the offer to have a big promotion and move to the East Coast, but I felt like in a way it was my time to go. I accomplished everything I wanted to. And, if you would have told me 18 years I would have been at one company, I would have said there's no way that's going to happen. But I was given so many opportunities to develop and grow. And I really was very blessed to have great bosses. And I look back on that time incredibly fondly. I ended up taking a little bit of time off when I left, not a lot, because I ended up getting another job very, very quickly thereafter. I didn't think that would happen, but I did. And I've never really stopped working, but that gave me the foundation to have the career that I have today. And I'm so thankful for that company.
That's amazing. What a journey. How big was the company when they decided to make that investment in you and to build out the talent acquisition team?
The business that I supported, there were probably about 1,500 people. And what was happening is we had locations all over the country, and all of the locations were doing their staffing separately.
Mm,
We had to adhere to affirmative action plans because we were a government contractor. And so there were a lot of things that were happening at the site levels that certainly should not have been happening. And so part of the reason why they wanted to centralize the department was just to make sure from a risk perspective, we didn't have that risk. And so they we outsourced a lot of our talent acquisition in addition to the sites managing it on their own. But my boss and the leadership team said we have to centralize this function, and we have to have a department fully dedicated and manage all the staffing for all of the locations. And so when my boss tapped me on the shoulder to do this, I said, I don't think I can do this. Like, this is a really big ask. And I didn't have a lot of experience in talent acquisition at the time. And he said, I have the confidence in you, and you do what you need to do to make this work. There were a lot of growing pains. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but looking back, I'm very proud of what, we accomplished. And I say we because it was my team that did all the work. I mean, I maybe oversaw the team, and from an org chart, yes, maybe I was on top, but my team were the ones that were awesome, and they delivered and they cranked it out. And so I give them all the credit for the success that, my team and I had.
that's interesting. What was the transition like going from HR business partner to, leading talent acquisition at that scale? Was there like a certain mindset shift? Were there certain things you had to learn? What were some of the biggest challenges you had to overcome?
Yeah, I mean, I never dabbled in staffing before, and I knew a little bit about talent acquisition because I worked in HR. But I said to my boss, I said, "Why are you asking me to do this? I have no background in talent acquisition." And he said, "Well, you've been a top performer as an HR business partner, and you're a hard worker, and you're strategic minded, and you think big picture, and I have the confidence that you'll be able to do this." And so, I said to him, I said, "There's going to be mistakes that are going to be made along the way, and you have to be forgiving of those mistakes because I'm learning as I go too." And I reached out to mentors that I had. I reached out to other people at the company that were in a similar type role. And I just somehow made it work. And I hired a really, really strong team of people. And I think that's really the reason why my team was successful again, is because of the team that I had under me. They were complete rock stars. And the success we had would never have happened if it wasn't for my 12 direct reports. And interestingly enough, I talk to every single one of them to this day.
That's great. I mean, that's
Mhm.
something I feel like your success is consistent with what I've heard from other TA leaders that I've talked to. They've also had a lot of success that transition from HR, and that whether it was in HR or some other role, they had some previous, operational experience, and more, like you mentioned, that strategic mindset. They really came from like this systems thinking background, methodical way of going about things. And I think that's like the foundation for any good leaders. You need to come with that mindset to approach any type of challenge. So it sounds like that's what, your previous boss had saw in you, and that was the vision that they had, in choosing you to lead the department. And
Yeah. I mean, I
obviously it
said to
paid
him,
off.
I said, if you want to hire externally, I'm not, you don't owe me anything. I'm happy, I wasn't happy in my role anymore. I said, but I'll figure out a way to make it work. And he's like, no, you deserve the opportunity to advance, and you deserve to do something different. You paid your dues in this very difficult role, which, again, traveling all the time, I missed out on a lot of moments with my kids when I was younger, and I can never get that time back. And now that they're older, like, I think about that sometimes, but I can't really change the past. But this role in talent, it was a very busy, but I wasn't traveling anymore. I was much more present to be with my children, and it made my work life balance much, much better. I mean, I was working probably longer hours, but I was at least home, and I was able to
Right.
have dinners with my family and be there in the morning when they woke up and send them off to school. But looking back on my career, it's by no means has been perfect, and I've made a lot of mistakes along the way. But I am incredibly blessed to have worked at a company that believed in me. And like I said earlier, if someone would have said, you're going to be there 18 years. It's funny. My dad worked at his company for 30 years, and I always used to joke with him and say, 30 years, like, people don't work at their companies for 30 years anymore. Nowadays, people switch jobs every couple of years. Meanwhile, I was at one company for almost 2 decades myself. But no regrets, no regrets.
That's awesome. And so with the companies you're doing some consulting with right
Mhm.
now, I know you mentioned biotech as one of the industries that you're doing consulting in. What tend to be the sizes of those organizations?
Yeah, there are startup organizations. One is 110 employees and one is 50 employees. Doing recruiting for a startup organization is very different than doing recruiting for a global Fortune 500 company, which is where the bulk of my experience was. But it's a lot of fun being a consultant. It's been fun. It's been fun. And I work part time for two clients. So I have a lot of flexibility in my days and it makes everything worthwhile. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's a very different type of recruiting. They take their hiring decisions much more seriously because when you have a smaller company, every single hire has to be, and you know this, right? You have to get it right every time versus a Takeda or a Baxter. When there's thousands upon thousands of employees don't work out, you let them go or they leave and then you bring on someone else. But when you are starting up a company, every hire has to be very, very strong because that's what's going to ultimately help make your company successful.
totally. Yeah. When every hire is such a big percentage of your overall workforce, it makes
Right.
such a difference on whether you can achieve your goals or not. And at a bigger
Right.
company, there's always going to be some natural rate of people that just don't end up working out that they end up replacing, but they have a bench or they've got a bigger team. And so the company doesn't really feel the impact of that as much as a smaller organization when somebody doesn't work out and what that can mean from a setback standpoint when that happens. So I could
Exactly.
definitely empathize with your clients that are taking those decisions very, very seriously.
Yeah, and
Um,
I'm an extension of their recruiting department, so it's really important to me that I really do bring in the best talent that I can because I
yep,
know how critical every hire really is.
yep. And so I love to focus on that for a minute here. So, I think right now there's a lot of talk on the market about how everybody's getting so much in terms of job applications, right? Like the quantity is really high. But as you mentioned, quality is ultimately what's really important. So as you're working with, the companies, especially the ones that are 100 or so people, they brought you on to be an extension of their, recruitment team, probably because they don't have a ton of resources to really build that out internally. How do you help those leaner companies really focus on bringing in quality versus historically, a lot of companies are more focused on quantity as a metric of whether or not the hiring process is going well?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different buckets. I think it breaks down to the sourcing, it breaks down to the technology, and it breaks down to the candidate experience. One of the things I post about a lot on LinkedIn is the candidate experience because I can't tell you the number of people that reach out to me on a daily basis telling me they're just horror stories of how they've been treated at companies during like different stages of the process. So that is something I feel very, very strongly about. But I think there are some things that companies can do to try to bring in more quality candidates versus unqualified candidates. And I think one of the struggles a lot of recruiting departments have, especially now with the job market being so saturated with candidates, is that there's a lot of unqualified applicants that are applying to jobs simply because they need a job. So they kind of what I call spray and play, and they'll go ahead and just submit their background to a multiple number of jobs, even if they're not a fit, because these people they're not working and they really really need to work. And I'm seeing that too. And with my clients, is that I read through every single applicant that we get, and there are way more unqualified applicants than qualified applicants. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with the job market that we're in. But some of the things that I think companies can do is to kind of like help with this issue is I think it's always starts with the job description and the requirements. And what I say to my clients is you want to make sure your job descriptions are not vague. You want to make sure that they're precise and they're realistic. And you're using specific language that really captures accurately the responsibilities of the role, the must have skills versus the nice to have skills. And I think a lot of recruiting has to do with the employer branding. And I think a lot of companies underestimate just how important it is to have a strong employer brand. So, one of the things that I've coached my clients on is that their websites and even their LinkedIn page and their posts should really showcase culture and values. So, candidates, from my experience, will self-select better when they understand the working environment of a company and the expectations of a company. I know that there are a lot of companies on LinkedIn that have these like day in the life videos, which really helps candidates or applicants look at the culture of a company. And again, you want to make sure that you're having a culture where you're getting like the right type of people that apply because they feel they would be a fit with the culture. And then I think it's sourcing tools and screening tools, right? So like when I started this department years ago at Takeda, there really wasn't such a thing as artificial intelligence. No one talked about it, no one used it. But now there are so many platforms where there is AI-based screening tools where these screening tools can score resumes based on fit, which is going to help recruiters triage faster the right type of applicants. One of the things that we did at Takeda in our system, we used Workday at the time, we used knockout questions. And those were simple, okay, candidate, here's 10 questions. And then we scored each question, which would help us determine which candidates were a fit. So do you have X amount of years of experience? Are you eligible to work in the United States? And then we had specific questions based on the actual job. And so depending on the scoring would depend on if those people would automatically be screened out or they would actually move forward to move forward in the process. And then talent pools, I think, is very, very important. So, building relationships with promising candidates, even if there's no immediate role. One of the things that I do with my clients is I build relationship with potential candidates. I know in my mind which roles are going to be opening up in the future. And so to be proactive, I start building relationships with these candidates. And most of them I simply find on LinkedIn. And strategic partnership is really, really important. I think it's important that hiring managers are a strategic partner, just like the recruiters are a strategic partner. So I think there has to be alignment early on the expectations versus like the reality of the market. So what I always do with my hiring managers is I'm very clear with them about, hey, this is a crazy job market. These are some things we need to consider. And I educate them on the reality of what's happening in the market. And I educate them on what's happening in the biotech world because my clients are in the biotech space. And one thing I've always said to my team is you want to focus on quality over quantity. You want to focus on the right candidates versus submitting an abundance of candidates. So that might be a big quantity, but they're not necessarily going to be a high quality. And then I think monitoring and tracking performance and source of hire. One of the things that we tracked very closely was our source of hire. Which channels, how were we getting the candidates that we ended up hiring, right? Were they employee referrals? Were they internal movements? Were they from LinkedIn? Were they from Indeed? Were they from job fairs? So it's monitoring and tracking those sources of hires and then measuring the conversion rate. So you want to optimize also at which stage of the hiring process do candidates drop off? And if we have a lot of candidates dropping off when they have to apply, well, that's a problem. Maybe our application process is too arduous. Are they dropping off when they are faced with those knockout questions? Well, maybe that's an issue too. So I think that in order to really have an effective and efficient system and strategic system, it's important that recruiters are really focusing on, again, the quality, not necessarily the quantity. And luckily, there are so many great tools like your tool, like Spark Hire, that greatly, greatly helps recruiters.
Well, thank you for that. You bring up so many great points here, and I want to definitely circle back to the job description and how you're partnering with hiring managers as well. But you also touched on something about candidates self-selecting into the process and continuing to self-select at every single stage. I think that's also something that's often missed is we talk a lot about qualified applicants versus unqualified applicants, but there's also interested applicants versus on the fence whether or not I'm interested as an applicant versus people that really didn't read anything and they applied. And so I think that's a challenge that recruiters and HR teams are also facing is not only are they trying to sift through who's qualified versus who's not, but it's like at the application stage, even if you are qualified, I have no idea how interested you actually are in the position and how much you know about the organization. So it's almost hard to get too excited too early about a candidate before you know how interested they actually are. One of the things, an idea that I've been toying around with is almost this idea. I love that you guys use knockout questions. I think that's like a no-brainer for every team to be using just to get those like baseline requirements out of the way. But the idea I've been toying with is this idea of like the reverse knockout questions of like, are there questions or information I can put that you're almost required to read by the nature of it being part of the application, but it's about us as the company. So you understand what the hiring process is going to look like, what our work environment is like. Maybe my company needs you to come into the office 3 days a week. Like maybe that's something you don't want to do as an applicant. And maybe a lot of people aren't seeing that in the job description, but it's like almost forcing people to slow down and think about, am I actually interested in this position? Because that helps, when you get people, to apply and you start reviewing them, it helps people like self-select into the process when they know more about the company. And then it saves everybody's time once you get to that next step.
Yeah, you want to know what's interesting? So one of my clients is a full on site. So their employees are not allowed to work remote at all. It's 5 days a week on site. And in the job descriptions for the entire company at the towards the very top, we say in those job descriptions, this is a 5 day a week on site role. And we put it on top so it doesn't get lost in the body of a job description. So if people see that and they're not interested in coming on site, then most likely they're going to reject themselves and they're not going to go through with the application process. So it's making sure that the job descriptions are very clear in terms of the expectations. And I think it was very smart of us to do this because I don't want to review and waste my time reviewing candidates who potentially look like a good fit, but then I get on the phone with them and they say, oh yeah, and I say to them, yeah, this is an on-site role 5 days a week, and then they say, well, I'm really not interested in doing that. Well, then I wasted time not only speaking to the candidate, but the emails back and forth to schedule the call. So we state it immediately on the top of the job description just to set the tone. I think that's very, very important. But yes, I agree with you. I think knockout questions, especially when you're doing high volume recruiting, is really, really important. It just saves everyone time at
Yeah.
the start of a process. And I think all hiring managers and candidates could agree that time saver is a good thing.
Yeah, totally. And look, you work with a lot of candidates. So as you mentioned, you hear that, side of the story all the time and all the, horror stories around candidate experience. And I'm sure there's candidates that get 4 rounds into an interview process only to find out something that, would make them really not want to work for that company. And it's like,
Right.
if I would just would have known this information earlier, it could have saved everybody a lot of time. And so I think that's something that a lot of organizations need to do is lean into ultimately like what's best for the candidate, what information can I give the candidate, how can I enable them to self-select in or self-select out of the hiring process, because it's good for us as a company if we don't spend time on people that aren't going to ultimately want to work here, but also it's better for the candidate because why would they want to do multiple interviews only to find out like, yeah, this probably isn't a place I actually want to be or it doesn't align with my
Yeah,
expectations or whatever that may be.
exactly.
um, okay, so I want to come back to the job description because I think it's so basic, but it's so important and it's so often missed. And when I talk to people in HR, who are working with their hiring managers, one of the biggest complaints is like, oh, my hiring managers, they don't know what they're looking for, or they change their mind mid-process, and it's so hard to figure out which candidates to shortlist for them or to send over to them or to even attract and source in the first place because we're so unclear on what we're actually looking for. So take me to like the start of the process. How do you get that alignment with hiring managers to make sure what we put down on paper is really what we're looking for? It's crystal clear to job applicants when they're reviewing it, and it's crystal clear to the team so we know across the board what good actually looks like when candidates start applying.
Yeah. So the companies where I do consulting, and this was actually the same thing when I was at Takeda, is the hiring managers were responsible for creating the job descriptions. And once those job descriptions were created, then we have what we call an intake meeting with the hiring manager. So what I always have my managers do is in the bullet points under duties and responsibilities, put them in order of relevance of where they're going to be spending most of their time on. Because I think it's important that if you have 10 bullet points, the 10th bullet point won't be as important, but the first bullet point will be where they're spending the majority of their time on. And so what I do is I sit down with them and I say, okay, approximately what percentage, if you take 100%, break out the 100% and walk me through each of these bullets and tell me which bullet is what percentage, because that helps me better source candidates for them. So if I'm looking to hire, let's say, a regulatory manager, and the most important thing is someone has 10 years of regulatory experience, and that's like a non negotiable, it's one of the top bullets. Then when I'm reviewing resumes of people that apply to the job, or I'm proactively sourcing candidates, which I do mostly on LinkedIn, I will make sure that the majority of their prior experience or current experience, if they're working, is in that regulatory affairs function, and that in the totality of their background, they have at least 10 years. And then if there is, there's a bullet at the bottom of the duties and responsibility of participating in FDA audits, but they're only going to be doing that 5% of the time. I'm not going to necessarily hone in on that when I speak to candidates, because it's such a small part of their actual day to day. But the job descriptions have to be accurate, and the more structured and targeted they are, the better it is for everybody. And also, one of the things that we say in our job descriptions is we like to focus on outcomes. So what we'll have in our job description is, this is what success in this role is going to look like in the first 3 to 6 months. This is what success is going to look like in the first 6 to 12 months, and then up to 12 months to 36 months. So we like to be upfront about, this is what's going to make the incumbent a success if you do these things. And that also, I think, helps us find the right candidate, because if they're looking and saying, God, if I'm supposed to be, managing an FDA audit, I'm just giving an example, by myself, and spearhead this effort, but I only have 4 months of auditing experience, they might get scared and say, well, if this is what the success is going to look like and I have very little experience in this, they might just self-reject, because they feel like they don't want to be set up for failure. So I think job descriptions, again, have to be very structured. They have to be very, very targeted. And it's important that companies use language that attracts the right kind of candidate.
Yeah, and I love that you prioritize the bullet points in the way that you do. I think a mistake that hiring managers often make is they over index on one of those nice to have things. A lot of times because it's like a recent pain maybe they felt. So maybe in the example you gave, it's they just went through a recent audit and they felt like they could have used the help of somebody, but like it'd be a plus if we could have had the help of that person during that
Mm-hmm.
audit. And then they're hiring for a position, and maybe that is the 10th of the 10 bullet points, but a candidate comes across that has that experience and they just felt that recent pain of going through that audit, and so they want to prioritize that candidate. But it's like, hey, wait a second, this is bullet point number 10. Like there's other candidates that for the 75% of the other requirements are a much better fit. So how do you pull hiring managers back to the job description throughout the hiring process to make sure that they're still focusing on what they deem to be the most important at the beginning of the process?
What I always say to my job, to my hiring managers, is that they're ultimately going to be responsible for these people. And to me, any manager is as successful as his or her team under them. So if you find the right people and you hire the right people from the start, the department's hopefully going to soar. That person's going to soar. The new hire is going to soar. So it's really up to the manager to make sure that the job descriptions are always accurate. And if there's part of a JD that the scope of the role changes, so for example, I see this happen all the time. Someone resigns from the company and the company can't backfill that job, but we have another job that's open, and that job is going to assume some of the responsibilities of the person who just left the company. All of a sudden you have a job description that's different. So it's making sure that at all times, if there's any organizational change, or if there's any change in, let's say the manager's like, well, I've been thinking about it and the job's been posted for a month, but I really think we're going to need someone to do this, or they might not really need to do that. What I always say to my managers is, if something changes in the scope of the role, if something changes in the broader organization and it has to do with this role, you need to tell me, because I can only find candidates as strong as what my managers are telling me these people are actually going to be doing.
Yep. And how do you help? You mentioned 10 years of experience as one of the bullet points. How, a lot of companies will put that on the job description, but it's somewhat of an arbitrary number. How do you figure that out with hiring managers of what amount of experience is actually necessary for somebody to have success in this role?
So the first thing I do is I look at the actual level and the title. And I know titles mean different things at different companies, but if I'm hiring a senior manager, for example, in whatever function it is, a senior manager to me in most companies would be 8+ years of experience. So if the title's senior manager, but they're only asking the incumbent to have 4 years experience, I will press back on those managers and say, are you sure you really want it to be a senior manager title? I think that the level of the role has to equal how much experience we're actually wanting from these candidates. And so, because the other thing too is that, a lot of people, their job title is very, very important to them. Some people don't necessarily care about their title, but most people do. So if someone's going to be applying to a senior manager job, or let's say they have 20 years of experience, at that point, it's usually a director level or a VP level or even an SVP level. And again, titles mean different things at different companies. It's not always an apples to apples comparison. But when I review my job descriptions and I sit down with my managers, if I feel there is not alignment between the years of experience required and the salary and the job title, then that's a discussion that I'm going to start. We also want to make sure from a compensation standpoint, obviously companies have to be competitive in order to hire the best talent. One of the tools that I've used in the past is Radford. I'm sure you've heard of Radford. I think a lot of companies use it. But and then of course you have tools like Glassdoor and Reddit and LinkedIn where job seekers can do their own homework and they could dig deep in terms of, okay, this is the role I'm applying to. Is the salary as listed on the job description? Ideally, they're all listed on the job description. But ideally, is the salary in line with how many years experience the role is requiring? There
Yeah.
has to be an alignment there. Obviously, if you're hiring someone who's going to be a VP with 20 years experience, no matter what function, you can't necessarily pay $50,000, right? So at the end of the day, money matters. And to a lot of people, job title matters. There has to be that alignment again between the years of experience and what the company pays, because you're not going to get people knocking down your door if the compensation is not competitive. It's
Yeah.
just not going to happen.
Yep, totally. Yeah, you need good alignment there. I also think like you got to ask the hiring manager the question of, okay, you're asking to your point, I can only bring you candidates that are as good as the description that you give me. So if you're saying 10 plus years is your number one requirement, that means every candidate is going to be 10 plus years.
Right.
So the question for you is, would you hire somebody if they had 7 or 8 years, but the scope of what they were doing within those 7 or 8 years is consistent with the rest of the things that you're looking for?
I
The
think
answer,
that would be, yeah, I think that would be up to the hiring manager, because at the end of the day, and this is for every company I've worked at, they're the ones who make the final hiring decision. I am there to be a strategic consultant and partner, and I always provide my thoughts on whatever it is that I feel need to be shared. And my managers always come to me with questions. Ultimately, it comes out of their budget, whatever the salary is for the employee that they're hiring. So that's really going to be up to the manager. But what I also say to my managers is don't settle. If you feel that this role truly needs someone with 10 years of experience, go towards that top, the 10 years. However, if you find a candidate that checks all the boxes but might be a little light on experience, if you feel that this person is trainable and is willing to put in the work, the deficiency of not having the exact number of years of experience, maybe we can overlook that. If you feel this person's going to work hard and they're going to add value in other ways, it's really going to be up to the manager. But what I do is I give them different scenarios to kind of think through to make that determination.
totally. Yeah. And that's where a strong partnership is so important as you
Yeah.
built that trust with them. And so they can hear your guidance. But ultimately, to your point, they have to make their own final decision because one, it
Hmm.
comes out of their budget. But more
Hmm.
importantly, too, it's going to impact their and their team's performance, right? Because they're ultimately accountable for this person that they're going
You
to bring
know,
on the team.
yeah. And one thing that I think a lot of, and you might realize this obviously, as a business owner yourself, but I think what a lot of people don't understand is just how costly turnover is for a company. So it's not only taking the time to recruit for the backfill, but it's posting the job. I post about this on LinkedIn all the time, is that replacing an employee costs significantly more money than retaining them. So you want to make sure that ideally you're hiring the right people, because you don't want to be in a situation where 4 months later the person leaves, then you have to start from scratch. Other people might have to assume some of the work. You have a deficiency in the department, and then there's going to be all this time taken to actually interview candidates. You got to onboard someone. So bringing someone on as a replacement is, again, always going to be more costly than just paying people what they're worth. And I think a lot of people, especially either business owners or people managers, learn the lesson the hard way.
100%. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this, which is how much more impactful that is at a smaller organization. Because if you think about, you hire somebody, you take, 4 months or whatever it is, and you find out they're not the right fit. To your point, it's not just the time now to go back and start the hiring process. It's all those things that come with it, but it's also now the lost productivity of
Exactly.
having a good person in that seat for the 4 months that you just spent onboarding them. And now for the foreseeable future, like, you've just delayed that process. So everything you've built into your budget from a goals standpoint that you expected to achieve and this person would contribute to, it's now all delayed. So if you're thinking about a sales team and you're the sales manager and you need this person on your team, and that's factored into you hitting your targets of them being at full productivity in 6 months, if at month 4 you realize this isn't the right person, you have to start that hiring process over again. Let's say you hire that person, quickly in 1 month. That's now 5 months of lost productivity. Now you need
Mm-hmm.
another 6 months to ramp them up. That's really,
Mm-hmm.
you're now 11 months in,
Right.
compared to you wanted to be at 6 months. So you have 5 months of lost productivity, which, on a sales team of 10 people at a 100-person company, like, that's going to crush you.
A hundred
And that
percent.
happens a couple times throughout the year. Like, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
miss your number by a long shot.
Yep.
So one thing, and then I want to talk about candidate experience, and I think you have a really unique perspective here because of all the candidates that you work with. But the other thing that you mentioned when it comes to building quality pipeline of candidates is building a talent pool and developing relationships with candidates. Obviously, you're doing a lot of outreach on LinkedIn, and that's probably where you're sourcing a lot of people from. But
Mm-hmm.
how are you, going from finding them and messaging them to actually connecting with them and building some kind of relationship, so when the time does come when you have an opening, they're actually a viable person you could reach back out to about that position?
Yeah. So I have a LinkedIn recruiter license. Are you familiar with?
Yep.
Yeah. So I have a LinkedIn recruiter license, and what I do is I have folders for all of the positions that I know are going to be coming open down the line. And so I have those conversations with my boss at both of the clients I'm currently working at. And when I started there, I said, okay, what role? Show me it like a map of, okay, here's like a roadmap of, okay, it's January. What are your hiring projections, let's say, for the next 6 months? And so, what I've said to my clients is one of the things that I want to do for them is to start building relationships with people now. So, by the time we have a position that opens, we already have a potential listing of viable people. And so, what that entails for me is doing very, very key, dedicated keyword searches on LinkedIn. I really like using LinkedIn Recruiter. I think I've certainly not a master at it, but I think I've perfected it pretty well throughout the years. And I create a very nice message on LinkedIn. I don't send it in mass, so I send it individual to each person, and I personalize it using their name versus just, oh, I'm just getting this random message and it's probably being sent to 100 other of the same people. So I personalize the message, and I give them a very brief overview of who I am, and just wanted to, yeah, I'm a recruiter, and at that point, I'll say I work with different organizations, and I'm always looking to build relationships with really strong people that have really strong backgrounds. And most of the time, these people get back to me, and these aren't long conversations. They might be 20 minutes in length, but it's setting the stage for, okay, in my mind, I know if we're going to be opening a regulatory manager position in 2 months, I've already had a conversation with 20 to 30 potential individuals who are in the biotech field, who live in the San Francisco area, who are open to work. That's the other thing with LinkedIn recruiters. You can tell if someone's open to work because they have it on their profile. So those are typically the people that I reach out to. because they would be more prone to having a conversation with me. I have hired so many people. I can't tell you how many people I've hired based on the proactive reach outs and conversations that I've had. So this way, when we've had these positions actually open, I don't have to, hope and pray and cross my fingers that we're getting the right applicants that actually proactively apply. I've already started having conversations with people. So this way I could reach out to these people and say, hey, you might remember me. We had a conversation 3 months ago. We just opened a quality manager position. Here's a copy of the job description. Would you, if you're still in the job market, would love to have a call with you. And then we have a call, and then I push them through the process, and then we end up hiring these people. And it's what my managers love about this is that outside of paying for the LinkedIn recruiter license, we're not using agencies. We're not paying. All they're paying for is their, again, my salary and their in the LinkedIn recruiter license. But when you have a relationship with candidates and you kind of nurture them and keep them warm, it's amazing what can happen. And I would suggest, I'm a big fan of, and I know it's not going to happen at every company because of budgets, but I'm a big fan of having recruiters that do this sort of relationship nurturing. I actually had someone on my team at Takeda for all of the corporate positions at the corporate headquarters. I knew a roadmap of, okay, here is what our hiring is going to look like. And I had it for a full year. And I had someone on my team, and that's all she did, was she was forming relationships with people, um, and nurturing those relationships over time. So by the time we had these positions actually open, a lot of those positions were filled because of the initial outreach that she did months prior. And again, I know that there's a lot of companies that have very lean budgets, but I would recommend this to any company if they want to be proactive in their talent acquisition strategy.
Yep. And maybe it's something that somebody within the company just starts doing, like you mentioned at Takeda, you had somebody doing it full time, but like maybe it's a lean company with 100 people and HR is in charge of also talent acquisition. It's like, well, maybe let's carve out 10% of their time to do some form of proactive outreach and
Mhm.
relationship building. And so they're not spending half their day doing proactive sourcing, but it is something dedicated that if we believe as a company, in order to have quality pipeline when we're ready to hire, that we have to be proactive about building those relationships early on, like then let's make
Mhm.
the space for it.
Yeah.
Um, so that makes a lot of sense. How are you building those relationships? So you make the outreach, person connects, you get on a call, or you're messaging back and forth. Like, what's the way you establish that connection? So when you reach out again, they remember who you are, and they're excited about the opportunity.
Yeah. So when I talk to people, I always like to learn about them versus them necessarily learning about me. I want to make it more about them. But what I always do is have a brief introduction in terms of who I am, the purpose of my reach out, and what I let these people know. And it's the truth is that I do really strategy sourcing and talent acquisition consulting for the biotech industry. Most of these companies are in San Francisco, and in the past, I've been doing this for 5 years, and have worked with a variety of clients. And what I say is, the job market, I believe, which I do believe in biotech, it's very cyclical, but I do believe that there is going to be a lot of opportunities for additional people in the biotech space. And again, it's a very cyclical industry. There's no question about it. But I think people who are thinking longer term about their career are going to be interested in having a conversation with me. And a lot of times too, they check out my LinkedIn profile, which is legit. I mean, I do have a lot of followers, and it does show that I've been in talent acquisition. So I'm not just this random scammer on LinkedIn, as we continue to see all the time. I'm someone that has almost 30 years of experience, and I worked at a company like a very well-known Fortune 500 company, and I think that gives me a lot of credibility. Most people in the biotech space know Takeda, know Baxter. They look on my profile, they see I was there for 18 years. So the credibility is there from the start. And then when I tell them that I work with a variety of companies doing TA consulting for the biotech space, you're going to get people wanting to talk to you because this could mean a potential new career opportunity for them down the road.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, you definitely have that going for you of your background and your experience and what your LinkedIn profile looks like. So it's not surprising to me that a lot of candidates want to take that call. But I think there's also something to be said about the proactive nature of the outreach. Like, we
Hmm.
don't even have the position today, but I'm reaching out to you with a genuine interest and just getting to know you, learn more about you. So in the future, if
Exactly.
there's a potential opportunity, you're top of mind versus a lot of times when you get that outreach from recruiters that are sourcing candidates, they're like in desperation mode because it's usually
Hmm.
a reactive response to, we have an opening, we don't have pipeline, we got to build pipeline. So we post a job a bunch of places and then we just start messaging everybody that we can find on LinkedIn.
Hmm.
And it doesn't come off as genuine of a conversation because it's like the recruiter's got an immediate need they're trying to fill versus when you have that proactive conversation, it like brings that guard down a little bit where
Yeah.
it's like, hey, I'm just trying to make a genuine connection and network. And if it leads to something for either party, great. But if not, at least we know each other now. And with your background, you're a good person to know in the industry. So I'm sure that goes a long way.
You want to know something else that's really interesting too is that I have gotten a lot of referrals by doing this, where I've talked to people that have said, I'm really happy at my company. I don't have any thought of leaving, but I do know someone who um, works at XYZ company. I think you'd really enjoy speaking to him or her. And I get referrals this way. I don't even ask for referrals, but they come to me through these reach out efforts. So I think that having these proactive conversations again, not only helps build a pipeline, but that's how I have found people through their referrals.
Yep. I use a lot of sports analogies in a lot of my content and what I post online. To use a basketball analogy, it's kind of like you're just got to hang around the hoop. And so when the ball
Mhm.
bounces a certain way, you can just tip it in, right? And I think
Yeah,
that's what being
love
proactive
that.
is you're just around the hoop. And that's where you find those easy layups because you get the referral because you've done the foundational work to build a network and build relationships. If it comes to hiring and you haven't done any of that, you're just chucking up 3 pointers from half court and hoping it goes in.
Right.
And that shows in the candidate experience. So I think that's a really good takeaway for people. Jumping to candidate experience, you work with a lot of candidates, you hear a lot of horror stories. I also know as an industry in HR and talent acquisition, we've talked about the importance of the candidate experience for years and years and years. Yet we still hear all these stories. What do you think is so hard, especially when it comes to smaller organizations and maybe don't have a lot of capital or resources to invest in employer branding and all of these things to really make them stand out as an employer? Like, what's so challenging to do a lot of the simple things right?
I wish I can get my arms around this question. I think about this all the time. I don't know what the issue is. I've never seen, and I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, and I say this just based on what I see on LinkedIn and simply the messages that people reach out to me on their horror stories that they share with me, which is interesting. I don't know these people, but I think a lot of people just come to me and vent, and I'm totally fine with that. And I actually respond to every single message that I receive. I think a lot of companies, they either don't care or they don't understand the importance of it. What companies need to understand is we live in an era where candidates are sharing their experiences publicly and reputations spread fast, right? So even a few poor interactions can create a very negative lasting ripple effect that can hurt their ability to attract, engage, and hire top talent. Um, Not only do they have they're opening the door to losing top talent, but again, you have Reddit, you have Glassdoor, you have LinkedIn, you have platforms where people are going on and talking about their poor experience. And that's why companies have to be very, very careful. And the other thing too is that, when companies have a tarnished brand, it can lead to increased cost and time to hire. It can lead to lower quality applicant pools. It could lead to less enthusiastic candidates, higher offer rejection rates. I think it has a ripple effect. I wish I can get my arms around why there are so many companies that either don't care about this or I don't know what's going on, but it's almost getting worse, right? So you have I look at it as like, okay, here's the experience and here's the result. So you have candidate ghosting, or unclear communication. The result of that is talent are not going to, at any point, going to want to work at your company. You have public negative reviews. Well, that damages your reputation as a company. you have an inconsistent or a biased interview process, then you increase your legal risk and brand harm. You have a slow hiring process or a disorganized hiring process, you have higher candidate attrition. One other example I could think of is you have poor feedback handling of candidates. Well, then you lower the trust of those candidates and you're not going to have re-engagement. So there's a ripple effect of all of these pieces to the candidate experience. And I posted recently on LinkedIn that I would love to go into every company that has a poor experience and make it better. It doesn't have to cost a lot. It's not hard to do. It's focusing on the right things at the right point of the process. But to me, there's no excuse for it,
What do you
especially with the community, with the technology that we have today.
So we've talked a lot about candidate experience and the importance of that. And you work with a lot of candidates in
Mm-hmm.
your several businesses that you have. One of the things I know that's super important both to employers and to candidates is this idea of culture fit because it goes both ways. So I guess my first question for you is, why is culture fit so important?
Sure. So I actually feel pretty strongly about this question because when I do my hiring for my clients, one of the things I really look at strongly is this person a culture fit with the organization? And the reason why is because in my experience, I feel like it significantly affects employee performance, employee satisfaction, retention, and even the team dynamics. So when I think about like team cohesiveness and collaboration, employees who align with company values and working style, I think tend to integrate more smoothly into their working team. And it just leads to better communication and collaboration, and then really just, fewer interpersonal conflicts. And also, when employees feel they resonate with the mission and the vision and the culture of the company and the environment, what I have seen is they're generally more motivated and productive. I've seen conversely where when someone's values and mission doesn't necessarily align with the cultures, that's when their productivity kind of wanes and the motivation is gone. So culture fit often, in my experience, leads to higher levels of job satisfaction and higher effort on the part of the employee. And then, of course, I think, the biggest piece is the employee retention. So, as you know, as a business owner, losing employees can be very, very expensive, right? It costs significantly more money for companies to replace employees than it is to retain them. And a big reason why people do leave their jobs is because of cultural fit. And I know this firsthand working in talent acquisition for many, many years, where I have conducted hundreds of exit interviews. And a big piece of why employees leave is because the number one reason is because of their boss. And the number two reason is the fit isn't there culturally. It's not even so much they want more money or it's the workload. They just don't feel aligned with the vision and the mission and the culture of the company. So when you hire someone who shares the company's values and approach, I think it can significantly reduce the cost of turnover. And then, of course, I think things to consider are brand and reputation. So employees who believe in the company's culture are more likely to represent the brand in a positive light. And this is when tools like Glassdoor and Reddit come into play, because if people feel poorly about a company, they're more prone to go onto these sites and air their grievances. So yeah, I mean, cultural fit is very, very important when hiring. And for one of my clients, interestingly enough, we actually ask a series of questions that help us gauge if someone's a fit culturally. I do believe that most jobs can be taught, unless you're like obviously an attorney or a software engineer. Most jobs can be taught, but what can't necessarily be taught are people's motivations, their hard work ethic, and if they are a cultural fit. So yes, I absolutely believe this is really, really important and something that all companies should take seriously when they're assessing talent to come into their organizations.
Yeah, and you mentioned it a few times there. I think a lot of times organizations get confused and candidates get confused with the term culture fit and thinking it's an assessment of how well the candidate just fits in with the other people around them at the organization. But that's really not what we're talking about when we're talking about fit. And you mentioned the word alignment multiple times. It's more like cultural alignment, environment alignment, values, mission alignment that needs to be achieved. So you just mentioned with one of your clients, you guys have specific questions that you ask to evaluate and assess for culture fit. Do you mind sharing what some of those are, or just thematically what you're looking for?
Sure. So some of the questions that we ask, and they're very targeted questions, is what kind of environment brings out your best performance? Can you describe a company culture where you've worked in the past where you've thrived, and also ones where you didn't thrive? How do you prefer to receive feedback? Tell me about a time you had to adapt to a company's values or way of working. What does a healthy team culture look like to you? How do you celebrate wins? How do you celebrate accomplishments? What are you passionate about outside of work? I like this question because it gives you a window into the person's personality, which I think can really affect team chemistry. And I like the question, what's something unique that you can bring to our culture? And this encourages reflections on past contributions, really just beyond their technical skills. Um, the other thing too is that I always believe that, and I'm sure you'll agree with this as a business owner, is interviewing is always a two-way street. And I always say this to my clients who are in the job search, that they should be interviewing the company as much as the company should be interviewing them. And I think some good questions to ask the company regarding culture is, how do you describe the company culture? What behaviors are rewarded here? What's not tolerated here? How does leadership support work-life balance? It's interesting. One of my clients right now does not allow their employees to work remote ever. And it's a 5-day a week in-person job. There's very, very little flexibility. And that speaks to me about the company culture, because I don't think work-life balance is important to this company as much as it is to some of my other clients. And we have had many, many candidates decline moving forward in the interview process when they hear that the work-life balance is pretty poor and that there is no flexibility. And part of the culture is because of the fact that there really isn't a lot of flexibility. I also believe that company culture starts at the top and trickles its way down. So it starts with the CEO, it starts with the values of the leadership team, and then it disseminates from there. So if the culture of a company is strong, I attest that to having a really strong CEO who cares about the culture.
That makes a lot of sense. And I like that you brought up questions that a candidate can ask a company to learn more about their culture. And it's good when the candidates do from a company's perspective as well, because you want your candidates to get that insight, because you want alignment, right? It's not just
Mm-hmm.
about you finding a candidate where there's cultural fit or alignment. It's also about the candidate finding that, because if it's a mismatch on either side, even if you do end up hiring them, to your point, there could be retention issues down the line just because
Yeah.
of misalignment. So you mentioned some questions that candidates can ask a company, but what are maybe some things a company can do to proactively put this information in front of candidates? So maybe earlier in the hiring process, before a candidate has the opportunity to ask some of these questions that maybe they'd reserve for a more later stage interview. What are some ways that a company can showcase their culture at like different steps and maybe, earlier in the hiring process?
I think it really starts with the job description. One of my clients, a different client, in their job descriptions talks about the culture at the bottom of the job description, and it talks about the values of the company, the mission, and kind of the leadership principles, which all speaks to the culture. So what we're doing by doing that is, in essence, saying to these candidates or these applicants or people who might be interested in pursuing an opportunity at the company is, here in the job description, we're laying out our culture, what we believe in, what are our guiding principles, and you're being upfront at the start, right? And that, I talent acquisition, there's so many pieces to staffing, right? But I really do believe it starts with the job description, because that is what the candidates see. I also think LinkedIn. I think that companies should write posts about their culture. Maybe they're doing fun events with their team. Maybe they give 2 days off a year to do volunteer work. But if a company uses their LinkedIn page in a way to showcase what the culture is like, that is going to give candidates or prospective individuals interested in a job there kind of a window into what would life be like if I joined this company. So it's utilizing LinkedIn, it's utilizing job descriptions, and it's utilizing your careers page. I would say the vast majority of companies have a careers page on their website. Talk about the culture there, showcase the culture. That's your time to shine, and you really want to make it seem enticing to bring in as many applicants as you can.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. A lot of companies underutilize the assets and the web properties that they have available to them to share that information with candidates.
Right.
The careers page is obviously a great example. It's just an evergreen page. It's always going to live there that you can constantly direct candidates back to. But to your point, I think where a lot of companies miss on LinkedIn is they think, well, it's not like I'm going to be posting every day about our company. Like we have other things that we're sharing on our LinkedIn, and marketing controls our LinkedIn. But the reality is, like, you really only have to post a few times to share the content or share relevant information. If you feel like there's value to be added in a post where it can actually share something meaningful about your company and your culture, you should share it. But that doesn't mean you have to do it every day. It doesn't mean that all of your candidates are in the hiring process have to just naturally come across on their feed, because the reality is it lives there. So there's a link. And so now what you do is you take that link and you embed it into your candidate communication. So even if the post is 4 months old about maybe something about your culture, or maybe some way that you guys were giving back at an event you participated in, you can link those things in your candidate communication. You can link those things from your careers page. So those assets, those posts live on. It's not like a candidate just has to
Right.
see it today or they'll never see it. It's up to you for how you distribute it to those candidates. And I think that's a thing, is what talent acquisition teams need to be thinking about is creating content, quote unquote, once, but distributing it over and over, and having a program for how they distribute it through the hiring process. So candidates don't have to just come across it. You're putting it in front of them. And that's how you really get that information in front of them that helps them decide. To the point in the earlier part of our call is, am I going to self-select into the next step of this process? And so at each step of the process, when you're communicating with candidates, you want to give them information that helps them self-select in or self-select out. And that self-selection is a good process for everybody that's involved.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something really interesting too. So, one of the things one of my clients does, and I love this, and I tell them this all the time, is right before a candidate is interviewing, we send them an email the day before the interview wishing them luck. It's a very nice email. It's a very encouraging email, basically saying, we're so excited to meet you. Thank you so much in advance for your time. We wish you all the best of luck in your interview. And it's really like nurturing the candidate, and it's making the candidate feel valued. It's like just like a feel good behavior. And it's the first time I've ever seen any company do that, of all the companies that I've consulted with and worked at over the years. But candidates want to feel cared for. They want to feel like they matter. And a simple message. And what's interesting about it is we send it directly from our greenhouse applicant tracking system. So it's not time consuming. You basically spend 10 seconds and you send this email to the candidates, but it makes them feel kind of warm and fuzzy inside. Like, hey, this company took the time to send me this email and they want me to succeed. That to me is a sign of a really cool culture. And I do believe, and I post about this on LinkedIn a lot, is that a company's hiring process to me is also a window into their culture. When I look at companies that take months to make a decision and they put candidates through 10 interviews and then they have to create this detailed presentation, and these hiring managers get paralyzed in making a decision, it makes me think, like, how do they treat their employees? If they can't even get the candidate experience right, what does that mean about the employee experience? Versus companies that have very quick processes, they care about their candidates, they take care of their candidates. Those are candidates that are more prone to say yes to an offer because they felt they were cared for during the interview process. And it would make me think as a candidate, well, if I was taken care of this well and treated this well during the interview process and the hiring process, I can only imagine how great I would be treated as an employee. So I do think there is a big correlation, again, between how candidates are treated and how employees are treated.
Yeah, and it's funny, like it's the simple things like that, and they're simple in hindsight, like when you're saying it out loud, but they're not simple in the sense that so many companies clearly aren't doing that.
Right.
But, I think you bring up a good point in that candidates just want to know that you as their employer, you're going to have their back, you're going to be there to support them, you're going to be there to set them up for success. And so even a small touch point of just wishing them luck, it takes what's normally like a quite transactional communication, which most companies, if they even do this, are going to remind a candidate about their interview tomorrow. Here's where to go. Here's who you're going to meet with. That's it. Show up on time. And so it takes a moment like that and turns it to more of a, a relationship oriented communication touch point. And it makes, to your point, gives the candidate the warm and fuzzies of like, okay, this is a company that cares about me as a person and truly wants me to perform my best and is wishing me luck. And that's a good sign of how I'll be treated when I join that organization. And you and I talked earlier in the call about small employers, 100 employees, less, a little bit more, give or take. And what are the things that they can do to stand out in the market, especially with a lean team when resources are tight. And this is like a perfect example of it. Like you said, it takes a few minutes to send the email. It takes 10 minutes to come up with the template, save it. And then anytime a candidate goes to that step, you just send the email. And it goes a long way, as you've seen from, with your anecdotal, experience and evidence that you've got, it works. And so these are the things that I think like small employers really need to embrace is like, how can we stand out when we're competing with a big organization? Like a big organization is probably going to offer better pay and better benefits and a lot of things that a small employer can't offer. But what can a small employer do to stand out? It's the candidate experience. It's making quick decisions. It's giving good feedback. It's the giving the warm and fuzzies at all these touch points within these different hiring stages. So that would be like, a big takeaway I think I would have, if I were a small employer listening to this, is just do the little things and do them well. And if you do that, you'll stand out, 9 times out of 10 compared to other employers.
Yeah, I actually call that the employer value proposition, the EVP. Right now, as you know, this is a very, very challenging job market for job seekers. But I've been in talent acquisition long enough to know that every couple of years the pendulum switches. So right now, the I would say most companies have the upper hand because there's so many candidates versus when companies can't find talent enough and the really good candidates have their pick of their job. I really hope the pendulum changes back because there are so many amazing and talented people looking for work right now. But regardless, it's super imperative that companies really care about their candidate experience, especially the small companies, because that is when, especially small companies, because that's a lot of them are in their growth stage too. So you want to have a reputation where you're known to be an employer of choice, and as your company continues to grow, it is the best interest of any company, for sure. Small companies, you always want to hire the best possible talent that you can. But starting small and you're building a workforce that's going to really set the tone for success or failure versus, when I worked at Takeda, there were thousands and thousands of employees globally, thousands. It was a global Fortune 500 company versus these biotech startups that I consult with. These are very, very small companies that are in their inception stage. And one of the clients I was brought in was really to map out their entire talent acquisition process, systems, technology, so on and so forth. And one of the things that I always say to them is in every stage of your hiring process, whether it's starting at the job posting, whether it's a phone interview, whether it is sending them a benefits brochure, whether it's the verbiage in an offer letter, you want to make the new hire or the candidate feel taken care of because that's how you're going to hire the best people. People are going to want to go where they feel in their gut is like a good match with like their culture and their values, or I should say their values and what's important to them. So when you're working at a small company and the company has a lot of growth, it's important to get it right. You can always pivot along the way, but I always say to my clients is if you put yourself in the shoes of a job seeker and you think about how would I want to be treated, you can never go wrong.
Yep. And I think that goes back to what you were saying in terms of, in your career, when you've seen, employees resign from companies, the number one reason is their manager. And
Yeah.
oftentimes, whether you want to say it's their manager or the company, the reality is the sentiment is that they weren't taken care of in some way or the other, right? Their needs weren't met, whether it was professional development or maybe it was just how they were treated on a day-to-day basis. The reality is they just didn't feel taken care of. And maybe that, somebody or the company didn't have their back or their best interest in mind. And I think that ties back into the hiring process. If you think about a candidate and where if they're deciding between multiple employers, at the end of the day, if comp is similar, if they're excited about both companies' products or services or whatever it may be, the differentiating factor is going to be how do they feel about that company? Do I feel like this company and the manager I'm going to be working with and the people I'm going to be surrounded with are people that are going to improve the quality of my life more
Right.
so than the other employers that I'm considering. So, Melissa, this has been great. I really appreciate your time. You've shared so many insights here. So glad we were able to connect. Where can people find you? Where's the best place for people to connect with you?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. LinkedIn. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, more time than I probably want to admit. But yes, and I'm very responsive too. I receive probably 150 messages a day on LinkedIn from people.
Wow.
It's a lot, but I always feel that if someone takes the time to reach out, then I owe it to them to respond. So it might take me a day or so to respond, but I will respond to you. But yes, you can definitely find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.